Hello and welcome to Media 7. In this program we'll run some tests on science in the media, look at the implications of Google's bid to strike a grand settlement with authors so that books are searchable too, and talk to Carol Hirshfeld about her new role at Maori Television. But here's a news mash to get us rolling. Rupert Murdoch's boy James hauled out the big guns for his speech about the evils of public broadcasting at the Edinburgh Television Festival. Democracy.
The expansion of state-sponsored journalism is a threat to the plurality and independence of news provision, which are so important to our democracy.
Orwell.
60 years ago, George Orwell published 1984.
Orwell again.
As Orwell foretold, to let the state enjoy a near monopoly of information is to guarantee manipulation and distortion.
But hang on, this is the man who owns Fox News Channel, where this kind of thing airs.
Unfortunately, the vast majority of biology textbooks today really censor from students any of the science that challenges Darwin.
If you have examples of how your kids' textbooks are wrong, go to foxandfriends.com and you'll find out how to send us examples.
Yeah, because censoring science textbooks at the behest of religious zealots is just what Orwell would have wanted. And of course we have the country's third best current affairs host on global warming.
We've been talking about, of course, the scientists who believe, as a result of research, that sea levels are going to rise by 1 metre in the next 100 years. And if you've got a beach property, that will alarm you. And this is the answer to it. We don't need to save on plastic bags or anything else. This is the answer. What if everyone in New Zealand took a jar of water from the sea and kept it at home?
Yeah, those scientists with their research. This is a job for experts.
In essence, global warming is happening, but it's happening not for the reasons that what we call the alarmists would say it is.
On the other side of the barricades, it's a rough week when US Liberal flagship The Huffington Post doesn't publish some quack with a miracle nutrition business declaring that the scientists are hiding the truth about autism.
The vaccine for measles, mumps and rubella, which is given to most children over the age of 1, has been linked with autism.
It's all too much for professional sceptic Dr Ben Goldacre, who told the BBC's Newswipe show.
I mean, that's extraordinary behaviour on the part of the media to selectively only cover dubious, worrying evidence whilst totally ignoring all of the reassuring stuff that was fully published.
Joining me now to talk about science and the media are the Prime Minister's new Chief Science Advisor, Sir Peter Gluckman, Science Media Centre Manager Peter Griffin, and New Zealand Herald feature writer Chris Barton. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Now, Professor Gluckman, has your new role changed your relationship with the media? It certainly made you more prominent.
I hope not. I've always tried to have an honest relationship with the media. I've always tried to make myself accessible and talk about the things I know and not talk about the things I don't know about.
What responsibilities come with the role, do you think?
Well, I think the role exists because New Zealand needs science if New Zealand's to stay in the first world, if it's going to become a different kind of country, a country that's edgy, innovative, outward-looking, proud of itself, rich, I hope. We need science, and most of the challenges we face will require science to solve it. Global warming, environmental change, the issues of other ways in which disease, biosecurity and so forth, they all require science at the basis of them. And so if we don't have a population that understands the complexities of science and how science has to deal with uncertainty, not with certainty, then the population can't judge the right way to go.
I was going to mention that. I thought that was the striking thing about your first major piece of written advice, the one on global warming. You directly confronted scientific uncertainty, which is often something that journalists really struggle with. They want a yes-no answer, don't they?
Absolutely. And I think if we take climate change, it's a classic example. I think we're going to see the same thing over water purity in New Zealand, fresh water in New Zealand. And that is, the science is unequivocal about roughly what's going to happen, but it's very uncertain about how it's going to happen and how much it's going to happen. And yet governments have to act on the basis of what we know now. They can't wait until we know exactly how much the world has warmed to in 2050, because it'll be too late to intervene then. And so it's just like armies. Good generals have to know how much information they have to have on which to make a decision. What science has to do is provide a balanced information critically looked at itself and give the policymakers the information which they can make the judgments.
Now, you ruffled some feathers with the global warming one. I would guess that if you venture into water purity, it'll be that to the power of 10. But is it perhaps your job to ruffle some feathers sometimes?
No, I'm not. My job's not to ruffle feathers. My job is to explain what is the scientific consensus, and where there is debate, why there's debate, and what the science means, and how certain or uncertain we are about a particular fact or a particular set of circumstances. From that, others have to make decisions on how to act.
You won't always get a good reception, though. I'm not sure if you're a Leighton Smith listener, but after the global warming piece, you declared that you were out of your depth and brainwashed. What do you make of that?
Well, I am brainwashed. I believe that science is essential to our future. I also believe that science doesn't know all the answers, but it has more answers than just rampant belief.
Peter, you're coming at it from another direction with the Science Media Centre, which was set up last year to try and bridge the gap between science and working journalists. How far towards bridging that gap do you think you've gotten? You've nearly had a year, haven't you?
Well, 15 months in now. Worked on about 1,200 stories. We've got about 350 journalists in our database who are dialing into briefings. We've done about 25 of those now. So we're getting the audience. They are coming to us. They're ringing us up, asking for experts and research and that type of thing. But they're mainly general reporters. We don't really have any science reporters. Unlike my colleagues in Britain at the Science Media Centre, they're dealing with The Guardian, The Times, established science reporters here. So we have to talk to them in a very different way. And to be honest, it is tricky. It is hard to translate the science properly. There's a sort of the common consensus really in the media at the moment is that a journalist should be a jack of all trades, that they should be able to cover lots of different subjects. They should be doing video, they should be blogging, they should be doing more than they've ever done before. The reality is that they haven't got time to do a good job on science, and that's still a big stumbling barrier that we face.
Actually, you, like Chris, I was going to ask Chris about this, you came to journalism via IT journalism, being a computer journalist. Do you think that had any impact? Because that seems to be one area where it's respectable to be a specialist.
Totally. There's a few bastions left. There's tech journalism, there's agriculture. When we have agricultural reporters dial into our briefings, just the level is so different. They're talking to scientists on the same level. Health is still a bastion. There's still a health reporter on most newspapers because public health is so important. Science, it's not that case. You see the byline science reporter, environment reporter, but they're not doing it full time. We quite often are calling up people saying, come to our briefing. They say, I'm on the evening shift tonight, chasing ambulances, I can't dial in.
And they can't make that time.
They can't make it.
Right. Chris, is there anything else that Peter could do for you with the Science Media Centre? Is he serving you well?
I think the Science Media Centre has been great in terms of bridging that gap. But I don't think the fault lies entirely with journalists. I think the scientists themselves are pretty difficult to get hold of in New Zealand, particularly in Crown Research Institutes and in other government departments. They're all filtered by PR agencies and people that will get in the way, stopping you sit down and talk with a scientist. I find if you get to do that, the story changes, but that's not. It's still pretty difficult in a number of areas.
Do you get the sense that the people you would like to talk to feel that they're at risk if they talk to you?
Well, they seem to have to go through rules before they can talk to journalists, and that just makes the whole process a lot more difficult. They've got to get approval before they can speak to us.
Professor Gluckman, you can clearly speak your mind. How do we bridge that gap and get through the layers of
that's a novel experience for me, because of course I come from the university sector where academic freedom and the right to speak is an absolute precious jewel of the university system through the Western world. I think the issue is that scientists themselves, when they want to talk to the media, sometimes have an agenda. And journalists themselves fall into the trap of trying to seek funds. And then the journalists respond by saying, well, we only want breakthrough stories. We don't want to dissect the problem out in any detail and make a complete story. Now, we have a few people who write features about science, and that's different. But most of the stories you see in the front pages of the Herald or the other broadsheets are somebody's cured cancer for the 27th time, the gene for a disease has been found for the 37th time, or diabetes has been cured for the 110th time. And because everybody wants to put things in the forms of breakthroughs, and science isn't like that. Breakthroughs in science are very rare. Science is an irregular process of accumulating knowledge until there's a new consensus, a new paradigm about what it all means. And that's the difficulty, translating that in a way that the public who are genuinely interested to understand that. When you have a media that wants to, or has that story been told before? Oh yeah, then we're not interested. Leads the scientist and the media people into a conflict. The media clearly wants to sell papers, and that's unfortunately in New Zealand about rape, murder, and the occasional scientific breakthrough, I guess. And where the scientist is wanting to use the broadsheet, and needs to use the broadsheet in particular, because it's the most useful resource for an in-depth story, to try and explain some very complex things which the public have a right to have translated to them by people who are skilled at translating it. Climate change, H1N1, whatever it is, these things need to be explained in ways which most scientists are not good at communicating. They've been trained to talk to other scientists using a jargon, using a whole lot of hidden set of meanings which do not translate well to the public. There are very few scientists in New Zealand who are trained to talk to the media. Now, if we go to Britain, it's a part of the funding system now in the research councils to fund scientists to teach them how to talk to the media.
And you actually have a role called science communicator, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, Peter, I'm interested in this idea of an agenda, because it would clearly be a mistake to think that every scientist who comes to a journalist has open hands and a pure heart. People do want things, don't they? How do journalists possibly pass that and interpret what's going on?
Well, it is tough, especially with the CRIs, and it's taken us a long time to gain the confidence of the CRIs so that they will dial into our briefings and present to journalists. It took a long time, and they're scared. You know, Chris and I recently in Britain, we went to a GM trial in Norwich looking at GM tomatoes, and we had the lead scientist there taking us through the process. We were touching the tomatoes. That would probably never happen here because the scientists are so terrified about how they'll be portrayed in the media. GM is a touchy issue. So aside from the fact that they've got commercial considerations, that they're representing commercial companies that have customers, there's that paranoia. It's a very closed system in some respects outside of university science.
How do you deal with that, Chris? If a scientist says something to you, do you go back and check the scientific literature? Is that viable?
Yeah, I mean, I think you always do that background research, and thanks to the internet, that's a hell of a lot easier these days.
I presume there are risks in that, because I've done that and I've thought, do I really know what I'm doing reading this?
I find if you can get to talk to scientists face to face, the story really does change. I don't find them difficult to talk to, and I don't find their language particularly difficult either. I feel that usually scientists I've talked to are only too willing to tell you all about their research and what they're doing, and to answer your dumb questions, which really is the kind of approach I take. If I don't understand what they're talking about, I'll ask them to explain it again and again until I can figure it out.
Do you think it helps that you've developed a reputation for actually being able to convey these ideas well? Is that a big factor? Rather than being some generalist who turns up on the day?
I think I have found that scientists do begin to trust you. I think that does happen in that dialogue, and when they see what you've written, they are then more willing to speak to you next time, definitely, yeah.
Now, you mentioned, I think, genetic modification, which is the biggest scientific debate we've had in this country. I get the feeling that at some point we're due for another round of that. How's that going to go?
Well, I think science has moved a long way. I think that it's like any area of knowledge advancement. Science can go so far, but science, unless it's accepted by the public, cannot then translate into action by the community or by governments. We fail, well, science was not advanced enough for there to be possible to be a community consensus in New Zealand about GMOs 10 years ago. Whether the science is at that stage for that to happen now, or whether there are other issues like our reputation as a clean in green country, etc., etc. I have no knowledge. What I do know is that the science has moved on and there's a lot more comfort and understanding about what genetic modification does and doesn't do and what the risks are. We know a lot more than 10 years ago.
And I think one thing, Peter, that may well shed some light on that when that time comes is your forthcoming new project, a science blogs platform. Sciblogs.co.nz?
Sciblogs.co.nz, which we'll be launching later in the month. And effectively what we want to do is give scientists a chance to dip their toe in science communication. So this will be an open platform where scientists can come and blog, and we'll start with about 18 to 20 scientists covering everything from microbiology through to climate change. There's an appetite for it among scientists who aren't necessarily all that comfortable sitting on the couch on the breakfast show talking to someone about science, but they're willing to write a column, and we're hoping in the same way that people like Ben Goldacre, who blogs under the Bad Science banner, he feeds mainstream media coverage of scientific issues. We're hoping that some people will emerge out of Sciblogs that will allow that sort of discussion to happen, because we track coverage of everything science related in New Zealand, and all the activity, all the analysis is happening in the opinion and the perspective pages, but it's happening. It's been written by people who have vested interests. There isn't one single full-time science columnist like Ben Goldacre who is analysing the science. It's all ring-ins, third-party people. We don't know what their real agenda is.
And you were talking about Ben Goldacre, also scienceblogs.com in the US.
Yeah.
But several people have come out of that to be commentators in their own right, haven't they? Is that what you're hoping for?
I'm hoping that we'll get enough confidence among a group of scientists. We have people like Sir Peter and Paul Callaghan. We need another level of people who are willing to take on that mantle.
And just before we finish, there's one issue that always hovers over science. We mentioned it briefly, which is funding. Professor Gluckman, that's not your brief. I don't know how much you can speak about it. So it's up to you, Chris. I mean, it's the journalists who have to write about this, isn't it?
That's a huge, huge topic that constantly comes up, and there's always the lack of funding, especially in blue skies research. And I think, in general, successive governments have never given much funding to science, and they're always struggling on that. That's a very familiar story.
Well, we have to finish here, so we'll see whether that changes. That is all for this discussion. Thanks to Sir Peter Gluckman, Peter Griffin and Chris Barton. After the break, the Google Books settlement, a groundbreaking initiative in search or a giant copyright rip-off.